The Book of Hench, Part 12. It's been a few weeks since we've moved through an episode focused on Disney designer John Hench. This is where we last left off. In the final months of 1965, Walt Disney announced that he planned to build a city on his property in Florida along with the theme park, hotels, and resort area. Initially, he suggested that he might build two cities, one based on nostalgia for the recent past and another based on near-future living. Shortly after making that announcement, he focused in on a single city, a model for how communities might use technology and planning to create a superior development that would meet the needs of families as the nation moved toward the 21st century. Though Walt had participated in urban planning projects dating back to the late 1950s, his ideas concerning his own city were largely inspired by recent discussions with James Rouse, who wanted to adapt Ebenezer Howard's Garden City concept for a city he was building in Maryland, and the ideas of Victor Gruen, who believed that better urban planning models could solve many problems that American cities faced in the mid-1960s. At the time of the initial announcement, Walt's ideas were not yet formed into a cohesive plan. They were mostly a list of concepts that he had gathered over years, from how a town might be laid out to increase community connections, to the ways that innovative public transportation could decrease reliance on personal cars. In December 1965, he met with longtime Disney designer Marvin Davis to begin to conceptually lay out a city. But Walt also knew that to create a forward-looking city, he would need to incorporate experimental technology, systems that were presently outside of the WED design areas. To begin the search for new technology, Walt looked to his Imagineers. Though most of them had little, if any, exposure to urban planning, a few of them, including John Hench, would form a research group that would transform Walt's dreams into plans for a real city. Conceptual design was only one way for Walt to develop his plans. Beyond his work with Marvin Davis, Walt asked key Disney executives and designers to arrange research trips to uncover elements that would improve his plans for a model city. The individuals selected for these trips held a wide range of expertise, from Jack Sayers, who supervised corporate relations at Disneyland, to Joe Potter, who was developing the reclamation plan for the land in Florida, from Roger Brogy, who managed the machine shop, to Joe Fowler, who managed construction. Unlike earlier corporate excursions, in which Disney hoped to secure sponsorships for attractions, this set of trips had a different goal: to create research partnerships with companies that had access to cutting-edge technology and proprietary systems that would enhance the city Walt wanted to build. In terms of transportation technology, Disney already had access to near-future systems through the Alweg monorail and the Wedway People Mover, so on these trips, the Disney team looked largely beyond transportation, specifically to areas of renewable energy, communications, and construction materials. To find recent advancements in these areas, the Disney team would reach out to top American companies who maintained research and development labs, from RCA to IBM to GE, for new ideas and inventions. According to Card Walker, another research focus concerned social problems, specifically how better planning could minimize the troubles then experienced in urban centers. Quote, "Why are the streets so dirty?" Walker said. "What do cities do with solid waste? How do they get rid of it? Why is there so damned much traffic?" Through previous partnerships, Walt now found his company in a unique position to explore city planning. The World's Fair had allowed Disney to work with architect Welton Beckett. Years earlier, while beginning design work for his theme park, Walt had also worked with Charlie Luckman and Bill Piera, two men who designed CBS Television City, the Los Angeles International Airport, and Marineland. Through sponsorships for Disney attractions, Walt had worked with executives at Ford, General Electric, Kodak, Goodyear, and TWA. Joe Potter, a new addition to the WED team, was initially concerned that engineers and scientists wouldn't share corporate secrets with Disney. He felt it best to voice his concerns before he and other WED managers flew across country. "Some of these things are secret, Walt," Potter said. "How do I approach them?" Walt, lifting his eyes to meet the former general, said, "Just tell them I want you to see it." Even with this, Potter was still skeptical that Walt's name alone would open research labs to Disney designers. As he wrote letters to industry executives asking for a tour of their lab facilities, he explained that he personally would protect any corporate secrets they chose to share. He wrote to dozens of companies, including, quote, Westinghouse, IBM, Allied Chemical, RCA, Bell Telephone, Bell Laboratories, 2 plate glass companies in Toledo, Rockwell, Union Carbide, among others. He related key details about Walt City, but even here, he sensed that executives at major corporations might find it hard to believe that Walt Disney Productions, a family entertainment company, was seriously exploring city planning. According to Potter, the letters largely were arranged, quote, to get the idea across to American industry that something important was going to happen, with the promise that he would explain more when they met in person. As designers moved forward, the WED plan was organized around 2 different goals: to explore technology that could improve urban living and to invite some companies to participate in Walt City. The city by this point wouldn't simply have residential, leisure, and downtown areas. It would have an industrial park where corporations could develop and test new products. Walt believed that scientists and engineers working in neighboring buildings, even though from different companies, might share information in a way that would be mutually beneficial. A company such as IBM might share electronic technology useful in developing more effective cars over at Ford, and in return, Ford might share mechanical technology useful in developing moving components inside of computers. This, of course, meant that in the Disney-envisioned industrial park, each industry segment could only be represented by one company. Ford and GM, for example, couldn't both inhabit Disney space, as this would restrict the type of openness that Walt wanted to encourage between non-competitive companies. Beyond the possibility of informal collaboration, Walt believed that some products developed at the industrial park could then be field tested by residents of his futuristic city. Residents could test newly developed washing machines and vacuums, as well as a range of other products. Quote, Walt told me that every time there was a new bathtub would be invented, one Disney executive recalled, residents would get it and try it, and if it worked, everybody would get it. In this, Disney hoped not only to create an improved environment for research and development, something like a university campus that housed experts from multiple fields, but also create a ready test market filled largely with educated middle-class working professionals to provide feedback about products developed there. The research trip started in 1966, immediately after the winter holidays. Quote, we did an R&D tour of Westinghouse, RCA, AT&T, Roger Broggie explained. The WED team soon discovered that after the New York World's Fair, many executives in the Northeast were now familiar with their work. Executives at Westinghouse were particularly interested in Walt's plans to build a model city. As trips were being arranged, one executive there asked Roger Broggie, quote, do you think you could get Walt to Pittsburgh to see our lab? That was enough for Broggie to persuade Walt to send a whole, quote, plane load of Disney designers on a multi-day trip to Pittsburgh before visiting other cities. Among them, Marvin Davis, Joe Fowler, Dick Irvine, Bob Gurr, and Walt himself. For the Westinghouse visit, arranged during the 3rd week of January, the Disney team offered a presentation about the city Walt wanted to build, a project that at that time was typically called the City of Tomorrow. Included in the slides were early drawings made by Marvin Davis that showed how Walt's concepts could be arranged into real space. A city arranged as a circle, with a downtown district at its center, and on the other side of a vast greenbelt, small neighborhoods at its peripheries. A monorail would connect the city to other developments on the property, such as the hotels, the theme park, and a parking area. Inside the city, however, the Wedway People Mover would carry residents over the greenbelt from the neighborhoods to the downtown district. Once the presentation was over, Don Burnham, chairman of Westinghouse, opened research divisions for the Disney team to tour. Westinghouse engineers discussed possible improvements to the electrical engine used on the Disneyland monorail. The Disney team shared ideas about the Wedway People Mover. In return, Westinghouse managers showed Disney a working model of a new transportation system they had developed called the Skybus. Recently opened, Westinghouse had built a 1.8-mile test loop, an elevated roadway designed for electric buses that moved similar to the monorail, 20 feet above the ground. The Westinghouse hoped to automate the system similar to the Wedway. At that time, each bus still required an operator, but the system was impressive. Buses moved high above the ground on a narrow bridge-like road from one station to the next. Beyond transportation systems, Westinghouse showed Disney a working laser. Quote, "I remember Walt was very impressed with what lasers could do in the future," Bob Gurr recalled. The trip was also arranged around social gatherings to bring the two teams close together. After lunch, the Westinghouse team wanted to know how Disney films were created, particularly the true-life nature documentaries. They asked if Disney used all of the footage shot, but Walt, quote, told them the interesting parts were left on the cutting room floor, delivering the line in a humorous way, so the Westinghouse men would understand that he was referring to shots that, among other things, accidentally captured mating behavior. The stories helped the Westinghouse managers understand that Disney was just another company. Disney produced a product, though their product was highly visible, far more so than products produced by Westinghouse. In the evening, the Disney group attended a cocktail hour where Don Burnham was arranged into a discussion with Walt. Burnham, though a captain of industry, was nervous. Quote, "The guy's lower lip starts to quiver," Bob Gurr recalled. "He starts to sputter." Gurr understood the problem. Though Burnham was a corporate executive, Walt, after being on TV for a dozen years, was a celebrity. The power of TV, Gurr observed, was more intimidating than the power of corporate America. But Walt had also developed strategies to make others comfortable around him. Quote, "Walt would deliberately do things," Gurr added, "little motions, like loosening his tie and making his clothes kind of askew, so that you felt kind of friendly. He was a more approachable figure." In this, Walt knew how to arrange himself so that others would fall into comfortable conversations with him, conversations that were essential to assemble partnerships to build an experimental city. At night, the Disney designers were taken by a line of chauffeured limos to their hotel in downtown Pittsburgh. But as they entered the lobby, Walt saw that the gift shop was displaying the Disney merchandise on a bottom shelf, which displeased him. "Come on, boys, let's fix this," Walt said. As Gurr recalled, quote, "We all then proceeded to remove the other items from the top shelf, then moved the Disney products from the bottom to the top. Just as we finished swapping the price tags, a sales lady appeared. She stood there expectantly, looking with irritation at the group. 'May I help you?' she asked. Walt simply smiled. 'No,' he replied, 'we're almost done here.' In these few hours, even the newest member of the Disney team, Joe Potter, observed the unique range of Walt's abilities. He could make powerful men at ease over cocktails in an executive lounge. Yet he still cared about the smallest details, such as how licensed toys, products that individually brought little money back to the studio, were arranged in a point-of-sale display in a hotel gift shop. Quote, "We spent at least 2 days at Westinghouse," Joe Potter explained, "and went through their laboratories to find out what their PhDs were thinking would be the products that Westinghouse would start to develop in the next decade or two. After Pittsburgh, the Disney team traveled to New York and New Jersey, where they met with scientists and engineers at multiple companies, including General Electric. They saw a transportation system in which magnets propelled rapid transit vehicles down a track. They discussed new uses for the type of monorail that Walt had installed at his park in California. They explored material that might be used in the construction of better buildings. The mood was buoyant, at times exuberant. It was a group of studio engineers and artists teaching themselves about city planning. Their sense of optimism and excitement was at times palpable. Some of these men had started in animation or as camera technicians, but now saw their careers rise far above what anyone would have predicted 10 or 20 years earlier. Quote, "We saw a variety of wonders," Broggie explained, "miniaturized things and a full-screen TV on the wall in a picture frame." But also on this trip, Broggie noticed that Walt was not quite himself. At the age of 64, he was slowing down, walking in such a way that one leg at times dragged a little behind the other. Quote, "In New Jersey," Broggie observed, "Walt was limping and complaining about his hip. He could hardly get out of bed. At the end of the tour, he was fatigued." After that initial outing, other trips were arranged, though often with a far smaller traveling group. Joe Potter recalled traveling with Walt to Rochester to examine the layout of shopping centers, so Walt could see firsthand possibilities for the international mall he wanted to build at the center of his experimental city. On this trip, besides Potter, were Joe Fowler and Jack Sayers. Quote, "We didn't quite fill the Gulf Stream," Potter observed. In search of malls, they also visited Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Dallas. Quote, "It took me a little while to see what Walt was interested in," Potter explained. "He was only interested in people. How did people react to the presentation that was being made to them by the shopping center?" The goal in this, Potter soon understood, was not to create businesses with higher profit potentials, but to create businesses that better spoke to the needs of its customers. If Walt was interested in profits at all, it stemmed from a belief that a business that effectively served the needs of its guests would naturally produce a profit. Though John Hench was overseeing concept development for New Tomorrowland, he was along for many of these research trips. The trips he knew also spoke to the goal of updating the futuristic sections of Disneyland in such a way that some exhibits would showcase wonders soon to transform the American home. Quote, "I don't know how many times he visited Bell Labs," Hench said. "We got to see products and concepts that wouldn't be on the market for 5 or 10 years. Though initially, Walt claimed he wasn't interested in creating his own airport, as plans for the city developed, he found that it would be advantageous to have an airport on property. With an airport, he could manage the entire experience of the Florida resort from the moment guests arrived to the moment that they left. An airport would also provide easy access for company executives flying in and out of his city to check developments inside the industrial park. But even at the airport, Walt wanted to showcase new technology right down to the runway. Walt had read about banked and curved runways that minimized the space needed for jets to take off and learned that such a runway existed in New York. Quote, "We made a special trip to New York and met with the guy in charge of that airport," Marvin Davis explained. During the early months of 1966, many Disney designers and engineers found themselves on these trips, but the central team was formed around Joe Potter and Joe Fowler, also Jack Sayers, who for years had functioned as a liaison between Disneyland and outside corporations. Quote, "I, and in some cases Jack Sayers, visited about 100 industries," Potter explained. "Whenever we saw something we thought was worthy of Walt's attention that might excite him, we'd tell him that we thought he ought to go see it. If Walt thought an invention or process useful, he'd bring it back to California to explore how it might be incorporated into his city, from garbage collection to road materials to energy cells. Around offices that were also developing mechanical pirates and a new animated movie, designers and engineers set up lab areas to explore inventions they learned about from other companies. Quote, Walt set up all kinds of things, John Hench explained. We had wastewater experiments all over the place at first. When asked what he was trying to accomplish, Walt, without hesitation, would explain his goals with a deep sense of sincerity, that even though he was known primarily as a movie producer, he was now arranging the components for a city of tomorrow. Quote, "It's like the city of tomorrow ought to be," he said, "a city that caters to the people as a service function. It will be a planned, controlled community, a showcase for American industry and research, schools, cultural, and educational opportunities." While designers worked to conceptualize Walt's city, a team of lawyers led by Bob Foster explored how Walt might develop this privately owned town in the middle of Florida, a town where Walt and the Disney Company essentially would act at times as a type of governing body. The creation of a futuristic city with new building materials and experimental transportation systems would likely require special ordinances if Disney were to move quickly into development. Quote, "We needed to do our own zoning," Joe Potter said. Now, zoning of a property is a very political thing, and if in a little area somebody wants to sell a lot for a gas station, the whole neighborhood will get aroused. If we wanted to do something on this property, our neighbors could require that we have public hearings and all that sort of thing. It doesn't lend itself to rapid development and rapid progress. This was particularly true, as Walt now wanted to build an airport and was interested in a power plant, both of which were typically regulated and often owned by government bodies. In this, Potter could see that it would be advantageous, perhaps even essential, for Disney to oversee zoning ordinances so they could lay out and expand the resort area as they saw fit. As Walt was interested in using some experimental construction materials, Potter also believed that it would be important for Disney to manage its own building code. Bob Foster, who oversaw the effort to arrange special provisions with governing bodies, understood that as Walt's plans expanded, they would need unique powers to oversee the development of a city, an industrial park, and a resort complex. Quote, "We needed an agency to perform the proprietary functions of government, sewer, water, fire," Foster explained. He believed that their best path was to directly control traditional government services inside of the Disney property as an improvement district. With an understanding of how municipalities and improvement districts functioned under Florida law, Foster assembled a presentation for Disney executives in which he argued that an improvement district, along with special legal provisions granted by the state, would be the most effective tool to develop the range of projects that now interested Walt. Quote, "I put all the powers on little cards. Building code, drain, zoning of land, inspection, gas, water, power, building roads, and streets," Foster said. "And I made a presentation to Walt." Foster proposed that Disney organize the Florida development inside of an improvement district, in which they would create 2 municipalities, one for the resort and amusement area, and a second for the community. He arranged the cards for different services under the 2 municipalities, one for the city, the other for the resort area, so that Walt and Roy would understand exactly what was needed to complete each project. When he was done, he had a few government powers left over, powers that needed to be housed somewhere in the development. "Why don't you put those in the city?" Walt said. With this, for the first time, the Disney team understood, at least in outline form, how to make a request of government officials in Florida, what powers they wanted to manage, and how those would be arranged for a very large piece of property. The municipal structure would need further refinement, along with a compelling justification for the state to hand over powers traditionally held by the government to a private company. But the framework for the arrangement was now drafted out. If approved, the Disney City would be a unique development, one where an entertainment company acted like a local government. By this point, Marvin Davis had been moved into a larger room at WED where he could better lay out plans for the model city, including maps and aerial overviews that, when unrolled, were 12 or more feet in height. For viewing and reference, these needed to be hung from the ceiling. Very few people had access to this room. Davis had one key, Walt had another. Others understood that it was a room of secrets, a place where Walt quietly worked out his plans for a new project. Around WED, it was soon nicknamed the Florida Room. Quote, "We raised the ceiling and lighting 16 feet to accommodate all the material we had to display," Davis explained. "We had a group of aerial photographs of the Florida property, which Walt had described as twice the size of Manhattan Island. We put together a mosaic of these photos, first on the floor, then on the wall of the room, and it was 16 feet high. We had rollers at the top and on the bottom of this huge map, and you could press a button to make it roll up and down. You could trace the roads that went between the swamps and see the areas of dry land between them." At times, Walt would bring executives from potential partner companies into the Florida Room and explain that this was the city he wanted to build. Quote, "He was trying to sell them on the project," Davis said. Walt would explain that it would be a pedestrian city with few cars and that everyone could walk from building to building, and how in such a place people would spend more time talking to each other rather than sitting alone in their cars. The city would focus on energy, education, and the environment. And as tourists glided toward the new Disneyland, they would look out their monorail windows and wonder why they couldn't have some of these new conveniences in their own city back home. For a while, Walt referred to it as a model city or as an experimental city. But sometime during this phase of rapid development, he decided to give it a name. One day, while Walt was visiting WED, he sat at a table with Marvin Davis, trying to find the name that would best fit this project. Rouse had used a regional name, Columbia, for the planned city he was then building in Maryland. But Walt wanted something with a more specific meaning. With Davis, he explored possible names. Then Walt's eyes lifted as he arrived at an idea he liked. "Why don't I call it what it is?" he said. "Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow." Then he spelled out the initials for Davis, EPCOT, EPCOT. It was an unusual name, a word without a traditional meaning, a word also with a little music. 2 syllables, 2 drum beats, the sound of 2 vowels finished off by the tap of the tongue. It was a name that no one would ever confuse with the name for another town. Most of the places Walt had developed included some version of his own name: the Disney Studio, Disneyland, WED, and Retlaw. But EPCOT, at least in its name, held no touch of Disney, as though it was a vision that was finally larger than himself. Walt nodded his head, satisfied to finally place a name to a project that, in fits and starts, had rambled around inside of his mind for months. "That's what it's got to be," he pronounced. By this point, EPCOT was arranged as a new type of Disney project, something beyond entertainment. It was a rebuff to critics who claimed that the type of art produced by Walt merely allowed people to escape the troubles of their daily lives. It had been years since the studio made the high-minded Fantasia, years too since the civic-oriented productions during the war, and the experimental wonders explored with Salvador Dali. Even Disneyland was arranged as a type of escapist fantasy in which guests were visually removed from the troubles of the urban world. Beneath this critique was a question asked by academics and scholars. Instead of creating escapist fantasies, why didn't Walt create a better world so that an escape from various social problems wasn't necessary? Though Walt rarely presented his ideas in the formal language of academics, EPCOT was his answer to this critique, a project that through example suggested that the type of design practices and technologies of escapist art, in their best iterations, could move beyond pleasurable diversions and create projects that existed outside of a theater or theme park and improve the daily lives of millions. But to produce a model city, Walt would first need to solve a range of design and policy problems, issues that his designers were exploring as they plotted out elements necessary to create a working city. A couple of things before we finish up today. First off, I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. Next time, we'll take a look at all of the ways the Disney parks and film projects continue to change as we move through these unique times. I've seen a lot of change rolled out in the past 2 weeks, and next time we'll talk about what those changes are and, more importantly, what they mean. Along with this, planning to visit the Disney parks, both in California and in Florida, has become increasingly complicated as we move through the pandemic with new policies, new patterns of visitation, new strategies to minimize line times, and so on. Before COVID, we here were on the verge of integrating some trip planning elements into Bandcamp. There were about 22,000 words, give or take, arranged into various scripts that would have contributed to this project. And then, well, in March 2020, all of that simply fell apart. Anything written before March 2020 really has no bearing on how trip planning works now. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll gradually begin to integrate some very up-to-date trip planning elements into Bandcamp, starting first with California and then later adding in the Florida resort. Traditional planning guides are published as books every year, and if you're listening to this podcast, you likely don't need a traditional planning guide. You know the parks. These audio resources will be designed to bring you up to date with the most recent information for your upcoming trip in episodes that last from 30 to 60 minutes. That is, an audio resource that will give you current information that you can listen to as you take a walk or drive to work. These episodes won't be a narrative podcast like most of our episodes, but rather a resource for those planning a trip. We plan to update them multiple times a year, as information published in travel guides assembled 6 months ago in these unique times would be partially out of date by the time the book was brought to market. This was part of our 2020 plan for expanding out the DHI podcast on Bandcamp before the pandemic, and now that hopefully the worst of the pandemic is behind us, we're slowly starting to integrate some of these elements into Bandcamp in the next couple of weeks. If you enjoy these episodes, if you find them a meaningful part of your week, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, and also soon you'll find there some planning resources in audio as well. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.